the man code is we don't talk about our emotions. We don't talk about our sexual experiences with other men because that's gay. And we definitely don't talk about being weak and being, not powerful and not strong.
Welcome to the Crucible Project podcast. The Crucible Project is a nonprofit organization committed to creating a world of men and women who live with integrity, grace, and courage, helping them to fulfill their God-given purpose. This podcast will discuss important and sometimes difficult topics while delivering practical life applications with men and women who are currently practicing this work. We are igniting Christ-like change in men and women through experiences of radical honesty and grace.
Well, hello, everybody. Welcome back to another Crucible Project podcast. I am your host today, James Damey, and I am here with Scott Cohn. Scott, welcome.
Hey, thanks, James.
Absolutely. It's great to be able to talk to you. I want to let everybody know before we get started that we are going to be having an awesome talk with Scott. We're going to be talking about sex. And so let's just put it out there right away. Now, it might not be how you usually talk about sex or how you're used to our society talking about sex, but this is going to be a biblical interaction, which I'm excited about, to hear some realistic ideas of what sex really is and kind of how things can get a little bit jarbled up in our lives today. So, Scott, it is great to be able to have this conversation with you. Let's just talk a little bit about you, your life, your family, and let us know about you.
Well, so I am a sexual addiction recovery coach. My practice, Successful Men, has been in business about 3 years now, but I did do this on a volunteer basis for a number of years before I ever became a professional. I approach things from a very trauma-informed perspective. So, I've had a lot of, why am I doing that? Well, because it's my own kind of personal story as well. I struggle with sexually compulsive fantasies and behaviors and started in recovery in 2014. And my initial foray into that was through more kind of behavioral management, or, I would like to call it sin management, very cognitive behavioral top down type of processes. And it worked. It stopped me from acting out for a good while, but I found myself really kind of being subject still to white knuckling it, like just trying harder and gritting my teeth and trying to work through triggers and cravings and all that. And at a certain point that fails because it requires a lot of mental cognitive processing that uses a lot of energy. It requires a lot of effort and it becomes exhausting. And so that was my course. And I had a big relapse. And in the course of that, I started training with Jay Stringer, who's a therapist, a fellow with the Allender Center, and started really kind of diving deeper into my story of my family of origin, how sexual abuse had shaped me as a child and as an adolescent, and how, trauma really gets stored in the body. And so you have to engage the body and the emotions to discharge it. You can't use really cognitive top-down techniques and therapy and just trying harder. It doesn't work, particularly for people with, developmental complex trauma, sexual abuse. And so, I had this circuitous route, which recovery is like that for a lot of people. It's not just a straight linear, woo, we climbed to the mountain and we're cured. And so what I do is I just work with men that struggle with sexually compulsive behaviors and trying to make sense out of their stories and helping to connect the dots between how they were harmed growing up and what they're doing sexually, so that they can start to gain some insight and start to do a better job of taking care of what their legitimate needs are underneath all those desires. And so I do that for a living. I'm married, been married 40 years to an amazing wife who loves me and has been really patient with me while I figure all this out. And I've got five surviving children. I had 6 children. One of my children died 2 years ago after a substance abuse struggle for 21 years. So there's been a lot of heartache in my adult life as well as growing up. And that's, ultimately what I try to bring to guys is helping them engage their stories and find a degree of kindness and curiosity about why am I doing the things I'm doing? And that approach is so much more transformative than 1,000 prayer-filled nights asking God to take my
Wow.
desires away. And so
Yeah.
that's what I do. And, I have a podcast that I do with a very good friend of mine that trained with me when we did the training for Jay Stringer's Unwanted group. So I lead unwanted groups. I lead small groups of men through unwanted. I have my own recovery curriculum. I do small group work with men as well. And then I have a podcast called We Got Balls with my friend Chris Inman.
Yeah.
And we talk about male sexual arousal and fantasy every week in a very raw,
Wow.
real, masculine kind of sex talk format that a lot
Yeah.
of guys have got a lot of help from, and their wives. Actually, we hear from wives that they really like it too. So anyway, that's a
Wow,
long
that's
intro.
great. No, that's great. I appreciate that. And so the your organization is called
Successful men.
Successful Men, and then you have that podcast. That's great. If people wanted to connect a little bit more, where would they go?
Yeah, they could just go to SEXCESSFULMEN.com, successfulmen.com. There's a way to set up a consult with me that I don't really charge a lot of money for. Most of the guys that I work with have been kind of around the block in recovery, or they've been doing men's work. They've been, going to weekends and stuff like that with various groups for some time. So they most of them are not newbies, although some guys have just gotten busted for acting out and were discovered by their wives, or they bust themselves and they're in a crisis situation. So
Yeah.
guys come to me in different kind of scenarios, but what we do is we start kind of digging into, well, where is this coming from? How is this serving you? And the general answer to that is, well, it's not. I want to get rid of it. When I'm like, well, hold on, it's serving you in some way, or you wouldn't be doing it. So let's
Right.
just be
Yeah.
honest about what are the good things you're getting out of acting out. And when you start to ask a guy to be curious about what he gets out of that behavior or
Mhm.
his fantasies, it's usually a sense of feeling alive, a way to calm down when he's feeling a lot of anger or he's
Wow.
got a lot of
Mhm.
anxiety going on. Maybe it's a repetition of childhood sexual abuse, and he
Mhm.
he doesn't see that he's kind of repeating patterns from the past, and that's a
Wow.
big eye opener.
Yeah.
About a third of men worldwide will be sexually abused before their 18th birthday. So it's a big
Wow.
problem, and it's a problem men don't talk about because the majority of sexual abusers of men are other men. And
Yeah.
so, because sexual arousal is almost always involved in abuse in some way, men feel a lot of shame about being sexually aroused by the touch or the care of another man. So, what does that mean about my
Wow.
sexuality?
Yeah.
And there's a big code of silence around this. The man code is, we don't talk about our emotions, we don't talk about our sexual experiences with other men because that's gay, and we definitely don't talk about being weak and being, not powerful and not strong. So for a man to engage in sexual abuse, he has to be willing to transgress those three cultural norms and be willing to admit he was abused, he was overpowered by somebody in some way, and engaged in sexual experiences that brought him some arousal. And because of that, he feels a lot of shame.
Mhm.
And even when a woman sexually abuses a man, which is rare, but it happens, it's not a favor. But culturally, it's seen as a, oh, you became a man. Wow, I wish I
Right.
had a hot teacher like that. It's
Wow.
it's not a favor. Trust me.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
that's some of the most messed up dudes you'll find is guys that were sexually abused by an older woman as, little boys, teenagers. And so it's about an invitation to just say, hey, let's look at how all this developed in your life. What was the context of your
Yeah.
family system? How did your mom and dad relate to you? How did they talk about sexuality or not? What was your church system like? Because we're all inherently religious and we're all inherently sexual. You can't be a human being without being sexual. And you can't
Mhm.
be a human being without worshiping in some sense. And I think
Yeah.
ultimately sex is a form of worship because it generates this sense of awe and gratitude. And according to the Apostle Paul, awe and gratitude in Romans 1 is what unbelievers refuse to give God. They refuse to
Mm.
stand in awe of him or give thanks. And yet our own bodies have this incredible capacity to have an experience that generates awe. And, think about an orgasm as like, ah, and oh,
Yeah.
thank you. Right. And so that's designed by God for a really good reason.
Yeah.
And it's not just about connecting us with one another, it's about connecting us back to Him. So,
Absolutely. Oh, that's great. And I think this is where that what you're doing with successful men and the Crucible project really blend well together. You've been a part of men's work for how long?
I've been really involved in men's work. I started as a result of my relapse, actually, doing a lot of the trauma based training. One of the things I realized that I needed to do is I have legitimate needs for connection with other guys in a healthy environment.
Mm,
And the Crucible Project was a great place to go and find kind of male friendship, male community in a container that's really about Jesus. And
yeah.
that's what I was looking for.
Yeah.
And so I really gravitated to, there's another group called Brothers Road, and they actually, Brothers Road and Crucible Project all have kind of the same origins with Mankind Project. So men's work goes back to the 90s. And then you had Brothers Road, which is not a Christian based group. It's more it's religion friendly. So you guys have, there's Muslim guys and Latter-day Saints and
Sure.
Christians and Jewish guys.
Hmm.
So I got involved with them, and I found that to be really helpful with some of their intensive weekends, and then also with the Crucible Project. And I actually went with a bunch of guys that I coach, and that was a really bonding weekend for all of us. So
Wow.
that was a lot of
Yeah.
fun.
Oh, that's awesome. That's awesome. So, what have you done in your personal life as you look back at the men's work and just combining to where you're at today? What work have you done?
Yeah, well, the kind of the core concept for my own journey and how I work with other men is to help them engage their story.
Mm,
So the fact of the matter is for men, well, let's just say this. Sexual struggles are common for everyone. And generally the way they show up in a man's life is hypersexuality. Not
mm,
always, but most of the time men are going to struggle sexually in being hypersexual,
mm.
which means
Okay.
kind of their sex life is taking a much bigger role in their lives than it probably was intended to. And they're
Hmm.
trying to work out a lot of emotional pain and a lot of heartache in their life through their sexual experiences. And it doesn't work because sex isn't designed as an emotional regulation vehicle, right?
Right.
And then on the female side, about 30% of females struggle with hyposexuality, which is low sexual desire. So you can see that kind of the way that we're being shaped by our family systems, by the culture, by our own experiences growing up, set us up for really having a lot of conflict in this area in marriages. Because if you've got one party who's wanting sex all the time because they're trying to work out not just connection with that other person and intimacy and pleasure, but they're also trying to work out
Mm.
some of their woundedness through those
Yeah.
experiences. And you've got the other person that avoids it because they find it to be a real source of shame and pain in their life. Not that the guys who are hypersexual don't feel shame too. They do. They're working out shame
Right.
differently. So you have conflict in marriage over desire. And it's just designed this way. It makes sense, right? No two people are going to have the same sexual desire level. One's always going to be stronger and the other is always going to be less.
Yeah.
And Emily Nagoski, who wrote a book called Come As You Are, which is a great book for couples to read, talks
Mm.
about how we have this sexual accelerator and brake. And she actually has an assessment that you can take that kind of identifies, where does my sexual desire kind of lean to? Is it more on the brake side or is it more on the accelerator side? So
Wow.
just
Okay.
helping couples kind of understand those dynamics and helping guys see then that the way they're engaging their sexuality has more to do with their childhood harm, how they experienced sexuality in their family, looking at their mother and father, how their mom and dad modeled it or didn't, and then how they then begin to experience that in their lives. What was the conversation like around sex
Mm.
or not? I always ask a guy, what was your penis called in your family? Oh, what does
Mm.
that have to do with any? Well, it has a lot to do. What was the
Yeah.
name that was used for your penis? Because our world is defined by the language and the words we use. So
Yeah.
if you grow up in a family where your penis is called wiener or your schnitzel or whatever,
Hmm.
and what is that communicating? It's communicating that that part of our body is silly, or we don't use the real term because it's embarrassing and we don't really
Right.
talk about that and
Hmm.
blah blah blah. So that sets the stage for then how are we going to engage sexuality. And unfortunately, there's a vehicle out there called pornography that's more than happy to teach you about sex if you're
Hmm.
a preteen
Yeah.
or a teenager, and they'll have the conversation with you. It's just going to be a really warped, one-sided view.
Right.
So you see these dynamics, particularly from guys with religious homes, where there's not a lot of conversation about sex other than
Hmm.
do not have it until you get married. And then when you get married, it's going to be great. Everything will work out. It just works. It's beautiful. There's no problems with, erectile dysfunction or premature ejaculation or sexual desire on your spouse's part. It's all going to be great.
Right.
And that's a lie.
Yeah.
And then on the other side, the culture is telling you, do whatever you want. Sex is
Hmm.
like a, all you can eat buffet. You can do it with whoever you want, whenever you want, how many people you want, whatever.
Yeah.
There's no limits.
Hmm.
And neither of those approaches are really great approaches to something that's so filled with desire and goodness and beauty, but also a
Yeah.
lot of frustration and struggle. So I
Yeah.
think it's important for guys to understand this is an area in their lives where everybody has struggles.
Yeah.
We all sin sexually because we're all sinners,
Yeah.
and sin has infected even our sexuality. And so just to have that open, non-shaming conversation, because the way religious systems try to handle this is they try to shame it out of existence. That doesn't
Yeah.
work.
Hmm.
And if you grow up in a family system where a lot of shame was used, a lot of no's were used
Hmm.
harshly, abruptly, unprincipably, and you're just shut down all the time, not just in your sexual desires, but all your desires, and your
Yeah.
emotions are shamed, you're going to find ways to be sexual that are really secretive, that are
Hmm.
really clandestine, because you're going to take your desires elsewhere.
Yeah.
And so helping guys understand, how was I formed, how was I shaped as a person, as a self, and then how does my sexual self develop in that environment, and where's the debris field of the harm in my life, because all of this is about how my desires were honored or not, or shut
Hmm.
down or not, and what I did with my emotions, my big emotions like anger, fear, sadness, shame,
Hmm.
when my desires get shut down or I get disappointed. And
Yeah.
and so it's an invitation to be curious about, how did this come into my life? Instead of,
Hmm.
why am I doing this? The
Right.
the tonality is, why am I doing this?
Yeah.
you know, and having that kind and curious conversation with ourselves,
Yeah.
and then out of the goodness that that brings in my life, bringing that to my spouse. So men's work, I think, provides that safe container to do a lot of this work,
Mm.
in an intensive format or a coaching format, which is why the Crucible is providing a really valuable resource to a lot of guys and a lot of women out there as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the things you said, Scott, was that you realized in your own life that you needed some form of a men's community. And so, what did being a part of the Crucible Project community bring to you in helping you with your work?
Yeah, I think it just provided an intense. I'm a big believer in the intensive format really bringing about some neurobiological change. So I go back to, from a trauma informed perspective, right? All the damage that's done to us is occurring in our nervous system. Trauma is not stored in the memory, it's stored in the
Mm.
body. So
Mm.
when you're together doing work with other men and it's all condensed in a short time period, it can be longer, but there's a real there's a real degree of freedom and effort and just kind of neurobiological change that comes by being in an intensive format with other guys doing the
Yeah.
same work, confronting shame, telling our stories to one another, working on processes designed to get at kind of the core beliefs that formed in our family systems and in our trauma. And again, that's engaging your body. Men have to do stuff with the external world because we're not all that in touch with our emotions. And an intensive format kind of pops the
Wow.
cork off of that and gives men kind of the freedom to engage their emotions with other men, which reduces that sense of shame. It's an invitation to actually take a look, be
Yeah.
introspective, and do that in the presence of other witnesses, and
Yeah.
that's how we change, right? We experience neurobiological change when we can tell our stories
Mm,
more truly in the presence of
mm,
others who, and Dan Siegel, psychologist, psychiatrist out of UCLA and the Center for Mindfulness, says that is the experience of being known, where we feel
mhm.
seen, especially in the places we feel a lot of shame. We feel
Yeah.
safe enough to be seen. We feel soothed. We receive comfort by engaging our shame and our stories of harm together. And that gives us the security to leave those kinds of communities or
Mm,
intensive experiences, to believe that even though I'm broken, even though I've got messes in my life, God's intention is to bring beauty and goodness out of my mess and create a message out of it. He's more interested in
mm.
telling his
Yeah.
story through me than me having this perfect life where I'm this model example of what a Christian man is supposed to be. Like, there is no example of that. There's
Right.
only really flawed guys that have kind of surrendered that facade and are willing to be seen in their brokenness. And that's what I found the weekends are a great format for men to do that
Wow, that's
in a
that's
safe way.
incredible. And just listening to kind of what you've been describing to me, a lot of this is brand new for me, and so I'm trying to put it into words in my own head as because this is a narrative that's not very common, I think, even among churches. And so, in thinking about this, it sounds like that shame has kind of two parts. It has a driving force to drive us into our bad habits, and then also it has kind of a paralyzing force to stop us from asking for help, to keep us isolated, like you were saying.
And also to keep repeating self-defeating, self-destructive
Wow.
behavior. So yeah, and how do you approach that? The methodology that I was trained in, which is story
Hmm.
work or narrative therapy. Also, I've done a lot of trauma training on my own, and one guy that I particularly love to refer others to is Gabor Mate, who's does a lot of stuff like this, and he developed an approach called compassionate inquiry, which is very similar to what the guys at the Allender Center and Adam Young and Jay Stringer, the guys that I tend to follow
Mm.
as my sages,
Hmm.
use, which is instead of vilifying your unwanted behavior. Now, this applies to any unwanted behavior. So if you think about unwanted sexual behavior, problems with drugs, problems with drinking, problems with gambling, how about social media? How about overeating? How about
Hmm.
workaholism? Most people don't see workaholism as a addiction, but it is. It's a way to cope. It's a way to avoid pain. And so Gabor Mate's approach is called compassionate inquiry. Instead of asking why this addiction or why this bad behavior is in my life, ask the
Mm.
question,
That's
where's the
good.
pain? Because I'm doing these things in a way to kind of escape from a life that I feel is overwhelming, that I feel I can't cope with, that I don't have the ability to handle. So, that approach of asking questions is, what is this doing for me? Let's first of all ask, if you're masturbating to porn, for example, rather than
Hmm.
hating yourself for doing that and trying to shame that out of existence, why not ask,
Yeah.
how is this serving me? And most guys I'll ask, especially from a Christian background, well, it's not serving me. I'm like, hold on, hold on.
Yeah.
It is. If it wasn't doing something for you, you wouldn't do it at all. If it was
Right.
all bad, you wouldn't do it. So what are the good things that it's giving you? And they'll answer, well, it helps me feel alive. It helps me calm down when I'm stressed out. It helps me feel connected. It helps me get a sexual release. The fantasies of the porn I watch help me feel like I am
Mm.
desired, or I belong, or I'm
Right.
part of the
Yeah.
guys, or whatever. There's lots of different reasons. So I write the reasons down. Okay. So you say it's this, it does this, it does it. Wow, it sounds like it's doing a lot of stuff for you. Now, let me ask you, are these things intrinsically
Mm.
bad or intrinsically good?
Yeah.
They're all intrinsically good. So how is it that the only way you think you can get these things is by masturbating to porn? When did that start in your life?
Right.
Let's talk
Yeah.
about that story. And so it's really pointing back to our developmental environment, which is our relationship
Mhm.
with our mother and our
Yeah.
father. And what was our family system like? What was going to church like? When my mother was angry,
Mhm.
she would. When my father
Yeah.
was angry, he would. When I'm angry, I will, right? It's seeing the connections between what I'm doing now and where that formed.
Mm.
Was anybody looking for my heart
Yeah.
in my home? So Kurt Thompson, Christian psychiatrist, says, we all come into the
Yeah.
world looking for somebody
Wow.
looking for us. And I say, if we don't find that person looking for us in our home, we'll go
Man,
find them
that's
somebody
good.
else. So it's about being curious, and it's about laying down the shame and the self-contempt club that we
Yeah.
beat ourselves over the heads
Mhm.
with because we feel shame, and we're trying to pay for our shameful behavior by beating ourselves up
Wow.
so we'll stop it, and that doesn't work. It actually intensifies the shameful behavior. But you're right, the cause of unwanted behavior of any
Mm.
kind is shame, and it's also the effect. Shame is the effect. So we end up acting out in unwanted ways because it confirms our belief that
Mm.
we're bad,
Yeah.
worthless people. And that's the essence of shame.
Wow.
Something's wrong with me. I'm bad. I'm
Yeah.
worthless. And so you have to go back to when did that come into your life?
Mhm.
And how did you then learn to escape those? Because shame feels really
Yeah.
unpleasant in the body. So when I feel shame, I feel this sinking feeling in my chest, my churning in my stomach. I shrink. My head goes down.
Yeah.
I avert my gaze. I feel small. I want to disappear. And that feels really bad. And so what do I do to get rid of that feeling? I go do
Yeah.
something that makes me feel
Mhm.
alive temporarily. But I also choose something that increases my shame. And I'm doing that intentionally,
Wow.
maybe not
Mhm.
consciously,
Yeah.
but definitely intentionally. So it's engaging. How did that start in your life? And learning to have a heart of kindness and care
Mhm.
to that little boy who the only time he ever felt connected was when he masturbated to porn
Yeah.
in his bedroom over and over again. So, do you want to
Mm.
turn away from him in shame, or do you want to turn towards him with a kindness and a compassion and a care? So
Yeah.
that's the gist of it is, telling the truth about our
Yeah.
stories, about how we were
That's good.
harmed. And, the big principle on that is engaging our stories with honor and honesty. If you look at the
Mhm.
biblical heroes, let's take Abraham, for example. Everybody looks at Abraham and
Mhm.
he's the father of our faith. He's the one that got this all going. He left everything behind and followed God. And, you know, we see him as this paragon of virtue, but he wasn't, because he sex trafficked his wife twice to save his own neck. And then he basically coerced a
Yeah.
teenager into having sex,
Mhm.
impregnated her to help God out because God was taking a little longer on
Yep, that's
his
right. That's
promise
right.
than right. So I'm going to help God. And then he drives her out into the wilderness pregnant with his own child to die. Now that is despicable behavior. Yet we
Yeah.
call him the father of our faith. So how did that come about? Well, it
Mm.
took 25 years of God continually working with him to confront his unbelief and his
Yeah.
sketchy behavior. And then you see the same thing repeated in his son, Isaac, who sex traffics his wife. And then you see a guy named Jacob come along, whose very name means supplanter,
Yep.
schemer, conniver. So I like to remind people, when God calls himself by the name Abraham, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, it's not a compliment to those two guys. It's saying, hey, I'm the God of a sex trafficker and a
Yeah.
sexual abuser.
Yeah.
I'm the God of a
Yeah.
scheming
Right?
conniver, right? Remember who you're dealing with here. This is about God's story, not about the
I love
heroes of the
that.
Bible
Yeah.
story. And so if we view the Bible in that lens, then we tend to be very condemning of our own stories and not honor, the way we were formed and shaped. And most Christian guys are
Yeah.
very, very sensitive, and they've been trained all their lives to focus on
Yeah.
their sin. You're a sinner, and what you do is your responsibility and yours alone, and you're the only one that is responsible
Right.
for the choices you make. Now, some of that is true, but Jesus said, whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to stumble, it would be better for a millstone to be hung around
That's
his
right.
neck and be cast in the sea. What that means is you
Hmm.
can cause somebody else to stumble. You can be one of the ones who causes a little one to stumble, or you can be one of the little ones. And he's not talking about
Yeah.
children. He's talking about his people, because little ones is a pet phrase Jesus
Yeah.
used for his people. You can be caused to stumble by somebody else. And honestly, the people that have the greatest impact in our lives, nobody
Mm.
forms our neurobiology or our mind
That's right.
more
Hmm.
than our parents. And if you're a parent, you have a greater influence than anybody else in your child's life. But this isn't really about you first engaging how you're hurting your children. It's engaging with honesty how you were
Yeah.
harmed in your family system, how that makes you susceptible to more harm. I think I told you this earlier. A third of men will be sexually abused
Yeah.
by their 18th
Hmm.
birthday worldwide. That's a lot of men that have endured sexual abuse. And it's
Yeah.
something men never talk about, because men are
Mm.
not supposed to be victims. Men are definitely not supposed to have sexual experiences with other
Hmm.
men, because that's gay. And men are not supposed to engage their emotions. And those three cultural beliefs prohibit men from engaging the harm of their sexual abuse. Most of the time, most men take that secret to their grave. And if they do engage it, it takes on average 26 years to
Wow.
start to engage. I was molested when
Man.
I was 5
Yeah.
by a neighbor or my older cousin or my older brother. And so being curious about, where did this start in my life? What was it like with my mom and dad? What did I learn about my desires? Were they good or shamed out of existence? What about my emotions? Were my emotions allowed, especially my big, intense emotions like anger,
Yeah.
fear,
Hmm.
sadness, shamed? Was I told, don't cry, big boys don't cry, or you want something to cry about? I'll
Right.
give you something to cry about. Or quit complaining, there's
Hmm.
starving children in Africa. Would
Yeah.
you like to be one of the, there's all these ways in which we're basically shamed and scolded growing up over and over and over again. And that's what gets
Yeah.
hardwired into our system. And then you add sexual abuse on top of that. And now
Yeah.
you've got sexual shame, and
Yeah.
that sets me up. So, how do we engage that? How do we tell that story more truly? Not just looking at our own sin.
Hmm.
Of course, we have sin in our lives, right? We make choices, but we're making choices not in a vacuum,
Yeah.
but out of how we were formed. And so, telling both sides of those stories, I have found to be very liberating,
Hmm.
very kind, very compassionate, and it actually invites us to repair with parents or with our own children where we've messed up, because everybody
Wow,
messes
that's
this
so
up.
good, Scott. It kind of goes back to that old adage: hurt people, intentionally or unintentionally. And so, I got one more question for you today, Scott.
Yep.
Maybe somebody has been listening, and for the first time, they've been able to pinpoint their personal shame in their life, and they've been able to see maybe a little bit of bravery come up to step into some of this work. Why is it important for someone to do that and respond now?
And it's important to do it, and there's an important way to do it. Shame is a social experience. We only experience shame in the gaze of another person. Shame is what's driving all unwanted behavior at the root of it. It's the foundation for why we act out in an unwanted way, and it's that effect of acting out, right? We know when we act out, we're going to feel more shame. Why do we keep doing it? Because it reinforces our core negative self view that I'm a bad, worthless person. If I'm going to get rid of that, and Brene Brown says shame needs three things to thrive in our lives: it needs
Mm.
isolation, it needs secrecy and hiding, and it needs judgment. And when we have those three things, we will be locked into shame
Mm.
and self contempt, because self contempt, hating myself, is the off ramp from shame. I, I go to the off ramp of self contempt to not feel the very crushing, empty, unpleasant, death like
Wow.
feelings of shame in my body. And so the way I pay for that
Yeah.
is to hate myself. And that just creates this vicious cycle. So, how do I dismantle that? I dismantle shame
Yeah.
by being in
Wow, that's
community.
great.
What I tell guys is the opposite of addiction isn't sobriety,
That's
it's
good.
connection.
Mhm.
And to connect regularly, consistently to change your neurobiology, which is where all this resides in your nervous system and in your brain and your emotions, to change all of that, which is necessary to have true and lasting change instead of just temporary, mind fixes. This is actually experiencing real change in my body. To do that, I have to do that in community. I have to do that consistently, where I can get the three things that I needed growing up. So the things that set me up for struggling with unwanted behavior, in short, are I never got attunement. Nobody was ever engaging my face, my heart, my desires, my emotions with kindness and care. They were either dismissed or they were shamed or minimized in some way. And I didn't learn to regulate my big emotions of anger, fear, sadness, shame. And as a result of that, I have a very insecure way of attaching to other people. And so I go to things instead of relationships to soothe myself or to feel alive when I'm feeling dead inside. And for that to change, I have to reverse all of those things. I have to be in community. I have to be able to tell the stories where I feel shame vulnerably and honestly, and know that you're not going to look away in disgust. You're not going to be repulsed. And when I tell my story and I receive that kindness and that sense of, man, I see a beautiful little boy here who had no other options other than to look at porn and masturbate to soothe himself in that family. Can you care for that little boy's heart the way we do? And you begin to experience that compassion from other people. That's what gives us permanent change within ourselves, within our own bodies and minds, and in relationship with others. So consistent community, help regulating my big emotions, and that repairs my insecure attachment, which repairs my view of myself. I begin to believe that I'm a beloved son in whom my Father is well pleased, because I experienced that in an embodied way from you. You're the body of Christ. So God came in the flesh, in person, to tell us, I love you, to touch us, to hug us, to strip naked and get on a cross and bear the trauma of his own crucifixion, to say to us, I'm with you. I know what it's like. I know what it's like to be abused. And what are we supposed to do with one another? We're supposed to bear one another's burdens. We're supposed to help lighten the load for all of us who are suffering the effects of how we were harmed and how we then harmed ourselves and others out of that. And so when we do that together in community, which the Crucible Project, I do that, that's the way we experience real and lasting change.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Scott. That's what an amazing message of hope. And I've really loved this conversation. And so thank you for your time. I really appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Absolutely, Scott. Well, if you've been encouraged to maybe seek out some community and freedom that comes from that, there's a safe place. And so you can go to thecrucibleproject.org or successfulmen.com. And we hope that this podcast today has been helpful to you. Remember, we do these every week, and so we hope to see you again. Remember, the journey continues. Let's do this journey together.
For more information about our weekends, please go to thecrucibleproject.org. Or if you're ready to get started on your transformational journey right now, you can connect with one of our Crucible certified coaches for a free 30-minute session at thecrucibleproject.org/coaching. That's thecrucibleproject.org/coaching. If you like what you heard, connect with us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Rate and review wherever you are listening, and don't forget to subscribe on your preferred podcast platform. Thank you for listening.